Okay, picture this. You've got these snow-capped mountains stretching forever, vast green forests, maybe the prime minister on a global stage talking climate action. It paints a pretty compelling picture, doesn't it? Kind of an eco-paradise.
Hmm.
That's the image the source we're digging into today starts with. But then it immediately throws some cold water on it. Not so fast, it basically says.
Right.
What if that image is, well, less about deep-rooted reality and maybe more like a fresh coat of paint?
And that's exactly the premise of the source we're unpacking today. It's called Canada's Climate Façade, a critical look.
Hmm.
Its whole mission is really to pull back that coat of paint, look beyond the sort of international image and the marketing,
Okay.
and examine the actual numbers, the actions on the ground. It presents what it argues is a different, maybe less seen reality.
So let's jump straight into that reality then, according to this source. And it starts, maybe surprisingly, not with total emissions, but emissions per person.
Exactly. Yeah, the source points out that while Canada is, a huge country geographically, its population is relatively small. We're talking around 39 million people.
Okay, so that calculation puts the per capita emissions in 2022 at 17.7 tons of co-euro equivalent per person.
Which is quite high.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. The source lines Canada up against other countries. The U.S. Comes in lower at 15.2.
Lower than the U.S., right?
Germany is at 8.1, China 7.4, the UK 5.3, and India is way down at 2.5 tons per person.
What's fascinating there, I think, is how powerfully that per capita number challenges that initial visual, that eco-paradise idea.
Right.
The source uses this data point right up front to sort of pose the immediate question. If Canada pollutes more per person than places like the U.S. or Germany or even China, well, how does that square with the clean image?
It definitely flips the script on just looking at, total emissions for a big country.
Yeah.
So if those are the overall numbers, where are those emissions coming from? The source puts a massive spotlight on one area in particular, Canada's role as a fossil fuel producer.
It does. It states Canada is the fourth largest oil producer globally. And it specifically zeroes in on the Alberta oil sands.
And it doesn't pull any punches here. It describes the oil sands as using some of the most carbon-intensive extraction methods on the planet. It even gives a specific number. Each barrel coming out of the sands emits up to 90 kilograms of co-euro before it even gets refined or burned, just extraction.
Wow. And the source's argument isn't just that this is a big source of emissions now, but that Canada is actively expanding this sector.
Despite climate pledges.
Despite the climate pledges, exactly. It points to major projects as evidence.
Like the Trans Mountain expansion, TMX. That's the government-owned one, right?
That's the one. It'll ship 890,000 barrels a day to the coast. And then there's the Coastal GasLink pipeline.
Which the source notes runs through indigenous lands to export LNG.
Right. So this raises, an important question the source poses. If the stated goal is net zero emissions, how does building massive long-term fossil fuel export infrastructure like TMX and Coastal GasLink actually fit into that picture?
Yeah.
The source really presents these projects as, well, direct contradictions to the stated climate ambitions.
Okay. But what about the good news we sometimes hear? Canada's clean electricity grid. That often gets highlighted. Does the source talk about that?
It does, yeah. It acknowledges this. It states the grid is cleaner than most. About 82% comes from non-emitting sources, mostly hydro and nuclear.
So that part's true, according to the source.
Yes, it includes that positive point.
But, and it seems like a big but in the source, what does this mean when you zoom out beyond just electricity?
Yeah.
When you look at total energy consumption across the whole country.
Exactly. And the source gives this breakdown. Oil still accounts for about 37% of total energy use.
Okay.
Natural gas, another 35%.
Wow, so that's over 70% combined.
Right? And renewables like solar and wind, they're down at just 8% of the total energy mix.
So while that clean grid percentage is, definitely a positive, the source uses that total energy breakdown to make a crucial point. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means how most Canadians heat their homes, power their cars, run a lot of industry, is still overwhelmingly reliant on fossil fuels based on this data. It sort of challenges the idea that a clean grid alone makes Canada inherently green in its overall energy footprint.
That's the argument. It's a different perspective on the energy picture.
Right. And if the overall energy consumption is still so fossil fuel heavy, how fast are things actually changing? In areas like getting around, transportation, and heating our homes. The source looks at these, calls them two sectors that matter massively for emissions.
It does. It points to EV adoption, electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Apparently about 11% of new car sales in Canada are electric.
Okay, 11%. And how does that stack up?
Well, it immediately provides a pretty stark comparison. Norway. In Norway, EV adoption is over 90%.
Over 90. Wow. Okay, that really puts the 11% into context, doesn't it?
It does, and it also looks at home heating. It notes that nearly half of Canadian homes still rely on natural gas or oil furnaces.
It's still nearly half.
Yeah, and it describes the uptake of heat pumps, which are seen as a key climate solution for heating, as sluggish, even with government rebates available.
Sluggish. So this highlights the source's argument that despite efforts, maybe some slick marketing as it calls it, the actual real-world transition in these really key high-impact sectors is happening, well, slowly.
And what stands out there are those comparison points, like Norway. They provide a kind of benchmark for what slow actually looks like compared to what's possible elsewhere.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. One of Canada's most iconic features, the forests.
Yeah.
Vast forests. For a long time, the image was that these forests were huge carbon sinks, right? Absorbing emissions.
That was the traditional view, yes.
But the source presents a really dramatic shift here. Its blunt counterpoint is basically, but not anymore.
Not anymore. And it supports this with a pretty shocking statistic for just 2023. Over 18 million hectares of forest were lost to wildfires.
18 million. That was the worst season on record, wasn't it?
The worst ever recorded, yeah.
And the source claims that because of a combination of things, it mentions logging, pests, and these increasingly severe wildfires,
Right.
Canada's forests have actually become a net emitter of carbon in some recent years. Not a sink, an emitter.
Which, if true, raises a really important question. If forests are actually emitting carbon rather than absorbing it, what does that do to Canada's whole climate math? Especially if parts of the climate strategy rely on, nature-based solutions.
Yeah, using forests to soak up carbon.
Exactly. The scale of this forest loss and the shift from sink to source, as presented here, it fundamentally changes the calculus of Canada's natural carbon balance, according to this analysis.
Okay, so we've looked at the per-person numbers, the fossil fuel production, the total energy mix, the slow transition, even the forests turning into emitters. Yeah. What about the policies? Hasn't Canada put climate policies in place?
Yes, and the source lists several key ones. There's the national carbon tax,
which it calls effective but divisive.
Right. There's the official goal of net zero by 2050.
But it notes there's no roadmap post-2030 yet.
Then the 2030 emissions target, aiming for a 40–45% reduction from 2005 levels.
Okay.
And the goal of a clean electricity grid by 2035, but adds that it's still in the draft stage and facing some provincial resistance.
So a list of policies and targets, but then what does the source say about the results?
Well, after listing these policies, the source delivers a very, very blunt assessment. Quote, Canada has never hit a single climate target it set.
Never hit a single target.
That's the claim. It specifically mentions missing goals set under the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, and even the early Paris Agreement targets.
Wow. So what's fascinating here is the pattern that the source seems to be pointing out. It's maybe not a lack of setting goals or having policies on paper, but a consistent track record, according to the source, of not achieving them. This consistent failure to meet targets is presented as pretty central to the source's whole argument about a façade.
Exactly. It suggests a disconnect between the ambition and the outcome. And finally, the source touches on Canada's image on the world stage versus its actions back home. It calls this diplomatic dissonance.
Right. You see Canada at the international climate summits, the UN, COP meetings, often playing the role of the, climate cool kid.
Yeah, the positive international image.
But the source contrasts this with domestic actions. It points again to things like expanding those oil pipelines we talked about.
TMX, Coastal GasLink.
Providing significant financial support to fossil fuel companies. It estimates subsidies somewhere between $15 to $18 billion.
Right, and it also mentions allowing Canada's export credit agencies to finance oil and gas projects overseas.
And it backs this up with an external view, too, noting that the international group Climate Action Tracker rates Canada's overall policies as highly insufficient.
Highly insufficient. So if we connect this all to the bigger picture, the source is arguing there's this major disconnect. Canada speaks one language internationally about climate leadership, but then takes domestic actions, particularly these financial and infrastructure decisions around fossil fuels, that directly contradict that image. That's the core of the source's analysis on this point.
Okay, let's try and bring all these pieces together now, because the source definitely has a very clear central conclusion it's building towards.
It does.
It essentially presents this idea of two Canadas. One is the country that markets itself globally, the one with the great image, the climate leader.
And the other Canada is the one that, in the source's view, remains deeply entrenched in a carbon economy, still very reliant on fossil fuels.
Now, the source does acknowledge areas of progress. It mentions the clean electricity grid we talked about,
Yeah, the 82% non-emitting.
the carbon pricing mechanism, even growing public awareness about climate change. It gives credit for those.
Yeah. Sure, but it argues that the reasons the positive image doesn't translate into actual climate leadership are these key actions we've discussed throughout.
Like continuing to export significant amounts of fossil fuels.
Relying so heavily on them for daily energy needs across the country.
And pursuing these big infrastructure projects and subsidies that, according to the source, fundamentally undermine the stated climate goals.
Yeah. The source's core argument really boils down to this lack of alignment, the gap between the stated climate ambition and the actual financial and infrastructure decisions being made, especially concerning fossil fuels. That's what it sees as preventing Canada from being a true climate leader.
So what does all this mean for you listening? We've spent this deep dive unpacking the source material, Canada's climate facade, and it's a pretty critical perspective.
Yeah, we look at the numbers it presented, the role of fossil fuels, the total energy picture versus just electricity, the pace of transition in transport and heating, that surprising story about the forests.
The track record on policy targets, and that contrast between the international image and domestic actions.
It paints a complex and frankly challenging picture based on this one source's analysis.
It really does leave us with that powerful contrast it draws. And the source actually ends with a thought for you to really consider, and, well, we'll leave you with our final quote directly. Until we align our actions with our ambitions, Canada won't be a climate leader. We'll be a climate brand.
A climate brand. Consider that distinction, leader versus brand, as you reflect on the information and the perspective shared from this source.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.